This is a panel I've been looking forward to for a long time. It's got three great panelists. First of all, the far end, Roselle Gonsalves, Head of Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging at ATB Financial. Next to her is Naheed, Nenshi, former mayor of Calgary, and an old friend. So glad to see you again. And immediately to my right is Meredith, Preston, McGhie, Secretary General of the Global Centre for Pluralism. And our theme this morning is really, we're going to really dig into the challenges that underlie the truth and trust theme of this whole event. I mentioned yesterday I've been in Davos, and one of the things that I sat in a very interesting panel on the future of democracy. And, you know, sometimes you see a statistic that brings home how much things have changed that you kind of knew was there but didn't really appreciate. And if you roll back 10 years, 2 out of every 5 people on the planet lived in what was regarded by the experts as a fully functioning democracy, and a further 1 out of 5 lived in at least something that had many of the trappings of a well-functioning democracy, and the other 2 were under autocratic or totalitarian states. Today, the number is 1 out of 5 live in a fully functioning democracy, 2 out of 5 in things that have elements of democracy, and still 2 out of 5 under some kind of authoritarian system. So in just 10 years, we've seen, you know, much of this sort of tide of populism and misinformation and the growth of distrust actually lead to a significant decline in people who are living under what I think we still think is the best system of government, which is democracy. So this stuff really matters, and I think each of our speakers today will bring a different perspective to it. But you know, the clock is ticking on this issue, and so what we do to respond to the challenges of building trust and promoting truth in what is recognized now as a post-truth world for many people, you know, it really couldn't be a more pressing challenge. I wanted to start actually with you, Meredith, as your focus is pluralism. I mean, what do you see as the biggest challenges or the most promising, the challenges that we have the most opportunity to perhaps do something about in this truth and trust area?
Well, thanks, Matthew, and it's great to be here in beautiful Banff with everyone. It's a big question, and I think a tough one to answer in terms of where the strategies lie. I think we're very clear that pluralism is under pressure. Some people say it's on the retreat. I like to believe that it's not retreating. Naheed, you had said on a panel that you and I were on together, which seems to be our routine these days.
I think we have a great double act that we're hosting today.
That pluralism needs a sort of a more muscular approach, that we need to be really leaning forward, and I believe in that really strongly, but at the same time, figuring out how we do that in a way that is really pragmatic and demonstrating that this isn't just something that is values driven, but something that genuinely benefits all people in society and offers a genuine pathway to a better life for all, not just democratic space, even in non-democratic spaces, that we can have this sort of peace. And there's lots of micro examples that I can give you for sort of where we see really positive things happening in, say, in the media, in local organizing, and so forth. But at the same time, I think the big challenge is how do we scale? And how do we look at some of the bigger structural challenges that are facing us right now? And I think you're going to be talking more about social media and the online space a bit later on. I think it's probably one of the biggest challenges is how we structurally push back against that. But maybe just 1 or 2 things to say that I think are particularly important about how all of us engage in all of this. And, you know, I come from a background of as a peacemaker, and truth and trust were sort of core tenets for what you do and how you do it. And I think one of the first pieces was to recognize that there is a relativity in everyone's worldview and perspective. And if we understand those nuances and connect with those nuances, rather than looking at them as immutable positions on either side, we can find ways to bring people into some common ground. I think that we have real opportunity right now to have difficult, uncomfortable conversations in different spaces with people with whom we disagree. I think, Lisa and Anne speaking to us last night about the Coalition for a Better Future is a great example of finding common purpose around something. And that's really at the core of what pluralism is, really saying we know that there are diverse perspectives and cultures within our community. Those give us strength, and if we can bring them around the table for common purpose, we can do something. I'm happy to give you some more examples.
Great.
I'll stop there for now.
So Roselle, in your business, what does this debate about truth and trust mean to you in practice?
Well, when I saw the language of truth and trust, my first thought was, whose truth? And Meredith, I appreciate you talking about the relativity of truths, right? Multiple truths existing together. And in practice, what that looks like at an organization like ATB is that we, as human beings, are nothing more than our stories. My stories that I have of me in my head, and my stories that I have of you in my head, right? And creating space into which truths can be deposited, we're a bank, is a pun. Creating space into which truths can be deposited, even though they might not always coexist or agree with one another, but creating the safety of that space often allows the foundation of trust to start being laid. And what that means is, if someone shares with me a truth of theirs that is not reflective of my experience, my knowledge, my life, my expertise, do I accept it as their truth, or do I need to judge, jury, and executioner it into my way of seeing the world? We talk a lot about truth-telling, and I want to flip that on its head a little bit to think about, how do we listen to truths? How do we hear each other's truths so that space is created? In a practical sense, what that means in the workplace when we're creating inclusion is that people have their stories to tell. We have 5,000 plus team members at ATB, and every single one of them has a unique story to tell. And there's not always space or room for those voices to be heard. So in my portfolio, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, we want to create space where everyone can be heard, with the recognition that historically and contemporarily, there are certain voices that have been unheard, and the volume on whose voices have been turned down. So how do we create the opportunity to listen to one another's truths? Last night, Mayor Gondek said a really powerful thing. She said the difference between safety and comfort, or the difference between unsafety and discomfort. How do we create the psychological safety to have some really uncomfortable, truthful conversations? And those are some of the philosophical underpinnings of how it works out in the workplace.
Thank you. Naheed, yesterday, we had a poll, who would you trust most out of a banker, a journalist, and a politician? And I suspect you can guess who came bottom of the poll. I mean, how do you feel like the environment for politicians? Could it get any worse, and therefore is this the moment for actually when you've hit bottom and now you can start to build back? How might that happen?
Matthew, when I was first elected, one of the great things that happened that I was never expecting is I got on the cover of Reader's Digest, and which lasted in people's dentist offices forever. And it was just a picture of me with the headline that said, "Who do we trust? This guy," with an arrow. I don't think they would have published that again today. And so there are a lot of things to think about here, a lot of things to unpack. But because I'm an ex-politician for this area, let me start by saying thank you all for coming. Hope you will spend some time in the city on your way home. It's really quite wonderful. And I know last night you got the new and improved version of me. But like the kitchen appliances in your grandmother's house, I just keep going anyway. And I also want to say, for those who have traveled from around the world to be here, I hope that you get a chance to meet some of the extraordinary leaders from this region who are in this room, who are doing incredible things every day, and I see a number of old and new friends with us here. But I want to take back a little bit, if I can, your question into a broader context. So I've been working on a thesis for a while now about how we as a world are facing 5 simultaneous world-changing crises, that any one of which would bring down a civilization. There's actually 6 of them. I did not have genocidal maniac invades another country, takes us to the brink of nuclear annihilation on my bingo card. But I have been thinking about the other 5. They are, of course, what we've learned about public health in the pandemic and how that has exposed fissures in our society. As I often say, we're all in the storm together, but we're all in very different kinds of boats. Some of us are in super yachts. A new billionaire was made every single day during the pandemic. Most of us, thankfully, at least in this part of the world, are in sturdy, warm boats that don't leak too much. Some of us are in rowboats. Some of us are in the water. And our response to the pandemic has shown us that we're not all facing this together. So that's the first one. The second one is one of ATB's major crises. I take some credit for that, Curtis. We've talked a lot about it, which is mental health and addiction. Here in the province of Alberta, we lost 1,700 people to opioid overdose last year. That is as many, or it is actually more people than we've lost to COVID over the course of the pandemic. So we have a silent pandemic of mental health and addiction. 1 out of 4 of us will be diagnosed with mental illness formally at some point in our lives. 4 out of 4 of us will struggle with our mental health, but we never talk about it. The third one is economic justice. It's become very, very unfashionable. Maybe at Davos they changed this year, but it's become very unfashionable to talk about income inequity. But in the Western world and the developed world, if you like, our levels of income inequity are higher than they've ever been at any point in the modern age. And this cannot hold. And as many of my colleagues from Calgary know, this is not by accident. We have actually designed a system that only works when we exploit people of low income. We've designed a long-term care system that only works when we exploit racialized people and new Canadians to come. It is by design. And so we have to figure out how those designs work for people going forward. The fourth, of course, is an environmental crisis. The carbon budget is quickly coming to an end. And the fifth, and the one that we've been talking about a little bit here, is a real reckoning on the issue of equity. What does it mean from going from a place that is pluralistic to a place that is truly anti-racist? So these are hard. And in my sunset years as a politician and in my beginning of whatever it is I'm doing now, I've been thinking about how we put these things together. And I've realized that there is a case to be made for very significant optimism. For the first time in my life, for the first time probably in any of our lives, we live in a moment where all of our assumptions have been upended. We live in a moment where the pandemic taught us that we can make decisions and change how we do things very quickly. So we live in a moment of great creativity. I call it a wet clay moment. And we have a chance to mold our future in a way that I've never seen before. But now I'm getting to your question. The problem is what we're talking about today. The problem is that people are feeling so upended, that people are feeling so moved out of their comfort zone by where we are now, that we are seeing greater elements of division and anger and hatred than we've ever seen before. And certainly people in my previous profession have had a lot to do with that. Many folks have discovered, whether it's in Hungary or the United States or here in Canada, that exploiting division is a good way of creating a wedge or a target that is just enough to win an election. But as ye sow, so shall you reap. And so we're in a situation where careless or sometimes strategically careless talk has led to these very low levels of trust in one another. And so the real question then becomes, how do we overcome that? And it's not just by having great politicians like Mayor Gondek do great jobs and people going, oh yeah, politicians are pretty okay. But it's something much more fundamental about how we relate to one another. Many of you will have seen the meme that went around particularly earlier this year, that said what they want you to believe about the division of society, and it showed a society cleaved in half, and it said what the division really is, and it showed a society with 5 or 10% cut off on the edge. And that is true. Right here in the province of Alberta, a very libertarian kind of place, we have over 90% vaccination rates. 90% of people did what they needed to do in order to protect their community. And so we have to figure out some way of getting back to that which brings us together. But I'll say one controversial thing to what you said, Roselle, which is there are people I don't want to talk to. There are people who have chosen to exit from what I would call decent society. And so one of the questions I would have for everyone here is, can we bring them back, or are they indeed a lost cause? A lot of these folks existed for a long time, but they existed as loners. We never saw them or heard from them. And because of designed manipulation, because of social media, a lot of these folks now believe that they are, if not the majority, they are strong in what they are doing. A final thing I'll say, I've gone on way too long because I'm an ex-politician, is when we had an occupation in Ottawa earlier this year, it took 3.5 weeks for the police to move in. And the night the police moved in, I was listening to the radio live, and people were interviewing the protesters. And these folks who represent a tiny fringe, and the Prime Minister said it and got in trouble for saying it, a tiny fringe of society, were shocked. They were genuinely surprised that the police were moving against them, because they thought they represented the majority of society. They thought the police was on their side. They thought the only person who was against them was the Prime Minister. And so they've grown up in an echo chamber where they believe that everyone who is right-thinking thinks the way they do. So again, I'll ask the question, is this salvageable, or do we have to move on with society with people, unfortunately, that don't include these folks? And I think that's the hard part for politicians, journalists, and maybe even bankers.
Can I grab that question?
Please.
I think it's an important one that you raise about sort of what are the limits of what we're talking about in terms of bringing people in, and how do you engage if you're going to choose to do so. And coming from a peacemaking background, this was one of the million-dollar questions always. Do you talk to the Taliban? Do you talk to ISIS? Do you talk to Boko Haram? And I worked for an organization at that time, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, where our answer was always yes. It was always that there isn't anyone that you wouldn't talk to, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you would talk to them today. That you have to figure out how to build the spaces to bring people back in. And there will be some people who simply you will never bring back in. I mean, that's a reality in all of our societies, and has been there for a long time, right? There's been extreme views for a very, very long time in our history. But I think that there are a lot of lessons to be learned from our peacemaking work around how do you think about these groups, and how do you peel off edges where there are people who are sort of tending towards but can be engaged in different ways. And the convoy, I think, was a really interesting example. I had a person from my past get in touch because I posted something about the convoy on social media, and she was stunned that I didn't support it, and stunned that Canada didn't support it writ large. And we had a very interesting, very uncomfortable and difficult week of conversations where I also had to unlearn some of the shorthand that I use when I talk in a room like this, that I can say things like brave spaces, discomfort, leaning in, and all of these things mean something to all of us here because we're all generally of the same world, and she was not. And so I had to really choose my words carefully. I had to stop from reacting when she said, this is about peace and love and our freedom and a tyrant in Ottawa. And those were things that I fundamentally didn't believe, but I had to take a breath and listen and hear. And I feel like I did get through, and I don't think I changed her mind, but I think that we had a genuine discourse in that moment. And so I think that there are these spaces that all of us can engage with, but we have to take them piece at a time. And we, in the peacemaking community, also think a lot about ripening, and this idea of how do you ripen the space so that those kinds of dialogues are possible. They may not be possible today, but we need to build towards a space where they can be possible, and recognize that there will be elements that simply need to be contained, but enough of that. When Trump was elected in 2016, one of the things that constantly came up was people saying, these were fringe views, and now they get to be mainstream views. They get a mainstream platform. How do you reverse that trend by not just alienating people, not talking about the deplorables, not all of this alienating language that isn't helping, but figuring out ways of reaching in so that people do feel included, even if they're not necessarily part of the same sort of political or ideological space that we're in.
I agree, and I love the language that you use, Naheed, about these people think that all right-thinking people think like them, and that's the right way to think. We all think that. Mm-hmm. We all think that we're the right-thinking group, and people who think like us are in the right. And I'm an eternal optimist, Maple Leafs forever.
Oh dear.
But go Oilers.
This is all gonna go
Where do you
horribly
live?
wrong.
But I will say that I think dialogue and communication are powerful tools that open up gateways. You know, and I'll quote Mayor Lumumba from last night, where he said, people aren't afraid of change, they're afraid of loss. And the 2 years of the pandemic have created this physical and psychological isolation. And isolation has bred isolationism, where people want to cleave to what they know and to what makes them comfortable. And I think that there's an opportunity here for us to say that wet clay moment. Let's talk to one another rather than at one another. It's not a you versus me, us versus them. However, I won't go so far as to say that we need to agree on everything, but there has to be that space for me to hear, like you said with your friend, for me to hear something that I might not fundamentally believe in. And just the act of hearing, the act of listening to someone else's experience creates that foundation of trust, because truth has been deposited into it. And that trust is then that resilient foundation that greater and more complex truths can be layered onto. I was in a workplace setting once where folks had put up Black Lives Matter posters. And somebody from the workplace came to my office to complain and said, I need you to put up White Lives Matter posters. And every fiber of my being reacted, except externally. And so I sat and I said, tell me more. Tell me more about how you're feeling with those posters up, and tell me more about, you know, what has caused this reaction from you. And they sat and they talked about it, and they talked about their feelings, and they, you know, I don't know that they fully saw me, the physical person, because they said, I'm not sure what these immigrants want. They have everything. I thought, well, I'm an immigrant and I'm okay. But we had an hour-long chat, and at the end of it, I said to them, I'm not gonna put up a White Lives Matter poster. We can disagree on this. But I really appreciate you taking the time to come share with me, and the door's always open. Well, a few months later, I sat on a conflict resolution panel that did mediation sessions. And the same person put in a complaint about a conflict that they were experiencing, and they needed a mediator. Now, I wasn't the mediator that was on the schedule for that particular caseload, but I was the person who was answering the emails that week. So I answered the email and I said, a mediator will get in touch with you. And they responded and they said, actually, Roselle, could it be you? Because I know that you'll hear me, and I know that we'll make something work together. And, you know, I really appreciate Anne and Lisa's comments last night about working across our divides. Yeah. Fundamentally, I believe that what unites us is far stronger than what divides us. But because we've become so comfortable in the language of us versus them and this othering, we've forgotten that we can actually sit in spaces that we disagree while still holding dignity and respect. And then finally, to your point about the movement of culture, I operate on the 10-80-10 principle. 10% of your people, like the folks in this room, are gonna be your all-in champions, the people that you can say the jargon to and they understand it. The 80% who, not really sure what this is about, but it makes me feel okay, so I'll climb on the bandwagon, kind of like my Oilers fandom, right? And then you're gonna have the 10% at the end who are just not in, right? The folks who are gonna say, I'm Maple Leafs forever, I'm not cheering for anyone else, right? And so your 10% at the front are gonna lead the change. Your 80% are gonna buy in to that change. And over time, you're gonna have a culture shift to which that last 10% is either gonna have to kind of move along with, or kind of experience that dissonance of, I'm not feeling myself represented here. What adaptation do I need to make in order to survive? Because ultimately, that's what human beings are built for, survival.
Now, Naheed, I mean, businesses, I think they have a different set of incentives that maybe make people more inclined to try and get along with their workmates. Whereas I think I look at politics, and the business model increasingly is around polarization, othering. The media, I think, has the same tendency. We like a nice black and white argument. We don't want nuance. It doesn't sell in the same way that real conflict, disagreement does. And then we have these social media companies whose basic business model is to make us addicted to having our own opinions, reinforced back at each other to tell us how right we are about everything. I mean, how do we start to change those models so that we can have that sort of sitting together with each other and maybe recognizing we disagree on some things, but we're going to get along?
Well, I think part of the problem is that it feels inevitable, but things, again, as I said earlier, are by design. So I often talk about this. You'll remember the scandal with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. And a lot of people don't understand what actually happened there. And it's worth thinking for a second about what actually happened there, which is folks who hold sort of anti-communitarian views have usually been loners. They usually feel like no one else agrees with them. They kind of hang out on their own. Of course, there are exceptions where there are hate groups that they can join, but typically they don't. And they certainly don't vote because government is all corrupt. And what Cambridge Analytica did was they looked at the totality of people's life online. They used a bunch of artificial intelligence to determine, based on what people were posting and kind of where they hung out online, who was likely to hold views that were anti-community, even if they didn't express those views publicly. They found those people, and this is the part what most people don't understand, which is what they did. They then put them into social groupings that reinforced their feelings, made them feel like other people agreed with them, made them feel like they were part of a coalition. They radicalized these folks with more and more radical statements and then put in pro-voting messages. So you turned a group of folks who never voted into one of the highest voting percentages there is, which is how you ended up with some wonky election results in the mid part of the last decade. And that has continued. So as you say, the social media companies have understood that that is actually very advantageous to their business model to allow this kind of thing to continue. So, it's not just that I talked about dishwashers and now I see dishwasher ads all the time. It's much more insidious than that. And again, it's all by design. And some politicians have figured out that this is helpful to them. But I don't believe this is a permanent thing. I believe that these coalitions are very fragile and that they tend to break. It was only 7 years ago in Canada that we had an election that turned on the issue of Syrian refugees, and it was almost unseemly because the parties were outbidding one another for how many Syrian refugees they would take, which is very different than what was going on in the rest of the world. And the Prime Minister famously on election night talks about how sunny ways will prevail. That was only 6 years ago. And so these things do move in waves. Now, one of the things that I'm fascinated by is the peace and love people, like your friend. They drive me insane. Always have. I don't believe in soft things. But no, the thing that is fascinating in Canada is in our last election, the very, very right-wing party doubled its support. But it wasn't very, very right-wing people. It was because the peace and love and yoga and healing people, who've always been distrustful of medical science and so on, found common cause with the alt-right people. And my question is, I've never really believed in left and right. I think that those are convenient for politicians and journalists. But I believe most people just, want to live a good life, have access to services that will help their families, and probably not pay too many taxes. That's why I wear purple every single day and have for many years, because it's red and blue. And I try to remind people that it's not about, your partisanship. It's not about your tribe. It's about your humanity. But all of that said, I am very curious how long-lasting these sort of coalitions will be. If you don't believe in left and right, is there a coalition of those who don't trust and a coalition of those who trust? And if that's the case, then you can break things out in a very different way. And so, you know, your friend, I genuinely believe, thought that that convoy was about peace and love.
Absolutely.
And, you know, the occasional Nazi flag, well, those are just, they don't really belong here. But of course, that's the core of the movement. And I don't think she was fooling herself. I think she genuinely believed it. But I also don't believe that that coalition can be lasting. Because at some point, the peace and love and yoga people who are sharing the memes of the racist people will realize, I don't feel right here.
I hope so.
So in a moment, I'm going to get some questions from the audience, so please be thinking up some good ones for this panel. But I want to ask each of you just to sort of give us one positive thing that you're working on at the moment to build trust in the world. So why don't we start with you, Roselle?
Sure. I met John Perkins yesterday, and he shared with me a term, and I've written it down this time, because I've asked it for it 3 times. Strategic doing. And it's this idea out of Northwestern University in Chicago that it's really difficult for human beings to buy into a big picture change. It's really nice to think about, like, oh, we'll live in that utopia, right? Or we'll fix climate crisis. But when human beings feel out of control of that big picture change, it's hard for us to see ourselves reflected there or to garner any kind of momentum towards it. And so the hope that I have is that we make small incremental changes over time that contribute to that big picture change. You know, we buy our straws that are reusable, we carry our mugs everywhere, those small changes. But, you know, within our institutions, if we're talking about inclusion, are we building that connective tissue of trust where people can see themselves reflected in their teams, in their leadership, in the values of their organization? Because that pathway of trust allows that fertile ground onto which truths can be offered, which then creates a system of trust and truth-telling. And that is something that needs to be created over time. It is something that needs to be, you know, sustainably scaffolded. And it gives me hope because one of my leaders, Tara, sitting in the back of the room, she calls me a lightning rod for people to come and talk to about what they're experiencing. And the reason that people come and talk to someone in my role or someone who looks like me is I act as a bit of a trust broker. I'm an ethnographer by training. I listen to stories and then I find themes and patterns amongst them. I have no HR jurisdiction or qualifications. I can't solve what's happening for them, but I can listen and I can guide. And that creates a little bit of a snowball effect where the more people come to me, the more people come to me. And that's what we kind of have in front of us, this opportunity to build the connective tissue of trust so that we can start telling and unpacking some hard truths together.
Naheed.
First, I have a book recommendation. That was great, Roselle, thank you. My friend Daryl Stickle has written a book with a very simple title, Building Trust, which gives you some very practical things to do in workplaces around how to build trust together. But I love the words truth and trust in the title of this. I'll add a word, and that word is service. So if you know me, you know one word in Sanskrit, and the word in Sanskrit is seva, selfless service. And I really believe that by helping focus people on making the community better through their own service is a way that you can start to move forward. In other words, let's forget about politics. Let's think about how we can build a healthier community. Let's think about how we can work together to do that. And so I believe this is part of the solution. The one thing I did not leave for Mayor Gondek that I literally took from my office was a big foam number 3. And that's a program that you are welcome to steal and implement in your own communities. It's called 3 Things for Canada. And all it is encouraging every single citizen every year to do 3 acts of community service. It could be something very small, shovel your neighbor's walk. It could be something very big, join a nonprofit board. Doesn't matter. What matters is that it's service. And it's not, of course, about 3 things. It's about creating a lifetime habit of service. And there's a little bit of pop psychology in there saying you have to do something 3 times to begin to create a habit, which is why it's called that. But it's that simple. We launched it with 0 money, just one big foam number 3. And over the course of the last several years, we've had hundreds of thousands of Canadians sign up to do 3 simple acts of community service. And I really believe that by helping people focus on that kind of practical action we can take, people using their everyday hands and their everyday voices to make change, that's how we get through some of the tribalism that's around us, by focusing on practical actions to make the community better. So I think service is really part of the answer to this problem of truth and trust.
Meredith.
So one of the things that was shocking for me, but has given me, I think, cause for hope since I returned to Canada. I was away for about 23 years and came back to live in Canada just to take up this role a couple of years ago, is reconciliation here. And so when I think about things that give me cause for optimism, although I know it's an incredibly hard road ahead, and just thinking particularly about issues of truth and trust, I feel like we have an extraordinary opportunity right now as Canada to do something real about our society that transcends a lot of the division issues that we've been talking about right now, because there are some core issues of humanity. There's some core issues of understanding our identity as Canada and what we have imagined as Canada as non-Indigenous Canadians. And I think that there's an enormous amount of resources and discourse and discussion happening now that certainly was not happening when I was in high school or in university. I mean, I have learned so much about the history of this country coming back in the last 2 years. And as a peacemaker, I find it actually really optimistic and hopeful that we are reckoning with it. And it's a difficult reckoning, but I think it's something that potentially makes the entire country and the society much, much stronger. And when I've reached out to peacemaking colleagues around the world, when the first graves were uncovered in Kamloops, the response from peacemakers around the world was really extraordinary, that they really responded with empathy and probably more solidarity towards us as a society, because we were saying, this happened. This is real, this is awful, and we have to figure out how to sort of educate ourselves. And not to say that we've come far enough. I don't think that we have. 52% of non-Indigenous Canadians think that this should be a top priority. 52%, that's not enough. 41% see Indigenous issues as a similar issue to other diversity questions in Canada, and it's not. It's something fundamentally different. So we need to change those metrics. But we also have we have APTN, we have a national media structure that is Indigenous-led, and across all of our channels, we have access to the information. There's extraordinary literature, arts, speakers, elders like Elder Alice today to educate us. And I think that there's an enormous amount that all of us can do in our lives, and that gives me real hope. That's given me real agency personally, coming back to be able to engage on some of these issues and to think about my role as a peacemaker in so many other societies where I got to be the outsider. And you got to sort of look in and bring people together and have a bit of passive distance when you're working on that. But to do that inside your own society is really profound. And I think it's something that we can all do, and it can have a really profound impact across all sort of political, geographical, class, and other divides in the society. So I think that that's one of the real challenges, but such an opportunity right now for Canada.
Do we have any questions in the audience? Yes, over there and here. We'll just take these 2 questions, and then we're out of time, unfortunately.
Hi, good morning.
Just say who you are as well.
Good morning, I'm Deidre White with Pixera Global. Thank you so much for that panel. I think I feel more hopeful right now than I felt in a very long time, so much appreciated. My question is for Mayor Nenshi, but very open to all of your responses to it. You mentioned the insidious nature of the business model of social media. And so I was curious, from a policy perspective, is there anything you think we should be doing about that or it could be from a non-policy perspective so that we can accelerate that positive wave of change.
Great. We'll take that question over here, and then we're going to wrap up and come back to you.
Thank you. My name is Joseph Wong, and I'm from the University of Toronto, where I'm a professor and the vice president there. I want to thank you, first of all, for a terrific panel, really inspiring and optimistic, as my colleague has just noted. And I want to add a little bit more to this optimism. Predictably, I want to talk a little bit about the universities. I think this is actually a space that we could really invest more in. The University of Toronto has 90,000 students. It is a convening place for conversations around truth and trust. And I think most importantly, all of us have alluded to, or probably thought back to when we were in college or university, and the kind of growing and learning that we've done since then. One of the things that I'm most amazed by when I talk to students is that they fundamentally understand these sorts of things. When they understand climate change, it's not just about straws, it's not just about blue boxes, it's about the damage that we're intentionally doing to the world. And they own that. It's really quite amazing, right? When we talk about critical race theory, which of course is a lightning rod in so many different parts of the world, students understand that these institutions are biased and they've been designed to institutionally and historically marginalize peoples.
Could I
it's
ask
that kind of
you just to have a question?
Yeah. So it's that kind of optimism, I think, that's really important. The question for this group is, are we prepared to actually accelerate young people into positions of impact in the organizations about which you're speaking? Because it seems to me that they are bringing with them precisely the kind of norms that we would like to have reflected in our organizations. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's start with you. Take whatever of those you want, and maybe just end on one thing that would encourage you if you saw it over the next year.
Okay, so very quickly on the question of policy around social media, I wish I knew the answer. Every time government attempts to engage in this, you end up with, again, a strange coalition of libertarians and others on the other side saying, how dare you interfere with this? And the problem is that it works. We go to Instagram because we get that little dopamine hit as we're scrolling through, or as I call it, doom scrolling through. That said, I do believe in that old adage that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I think that the more that we open source these algorithms, the more that we know how they work, the more that we hear from whistleblowers within these companies, the more people will be judicious about their use of this. I for sure keep a few anti-vax, anti-mask friends on the Facebook just to see where they're going and, quite frankly, how they've been radicalized and what is possible about de-radicalization. So we can do stuff individually to manage that. We can make sure that we're outside of our own echo chamber, even though the echo chamber makes us feel good. But ultimately, there has to be a broader reckoning here. I wish I knew what the answer was. And yes, we have to engage young people in a very thoughtful way. Universities, as you know, stink at this. I'm also a university professor, and we are designed by the tiny group of people who never left the university. So we've got to figure that out. And frankly, one of the reasons I decided not to run for re-election this time is because I was so touched by the young activists talking to me about equity that I said, sometimes you got to step out of the way and make room for others. And so hopefully we can all be thoughtful about that. We've still got a lot more to give, but in making that space for others, I think is critical.
And I would build on that, proud U of T alum here, that our classrooms are spaces to encourage critical thinking, the opportunity to ask good questions. And systems should be willing and resilient enough to stand up to those questions. And I think young people have inherited an earth that's already on fire, so they're okay with asking those tough questions. But I would even broaden it more widely to entrusting groups that have not historically been offered voice and platform and microphone because they have experienced the world that we are trying to solve problems for. And so opening the door to young people who are invested in critical thinking, opening the door to racialized and Indigenous communities because their voices matter and their experiences are going to lead the way for how we solve those big problems. And we need to keep asking the tough questions so that we can build trust in one another.
And if I can just, on that specifically, one of the things that we focus a lot on is actually giving educators the tools to have those complicated conversations in their classrooms. And we deal with high school educators, but I think it sort of broadens into that space where we can't also just assume because you're a university professor that you know how to have these complicated conversations around lightning rod issues with a diverse group of students. As we had a lot of teachers come to us after George Floyd was murdered and said, I'm a white teacher, I've got black students, I don't know how I open this conversation, but I know I need to do it. And so we did a series of webinars specifically on that. So I think there's a lot more that we can do to also give the tools to teachers. I just want to close on the point of social media with a podcast recommendation. I was hiking by the beautiful Bow River yesterday and listening to Yasha Monk interviewing Jonathan Haidt, who'd written a big piece in The Atlantic the other day, which is, I'm mangling the title, but it's something like, Why Have the Last 10 Years in America Been So Stupid? Which you can find online. But one of the things he was talking about is how do you structurally look at these questions of social media? And one of the things that he posits that I thought was very interesting was rather than looking at content moderation, let's look at making sure that we humanize every person who's online, that you have to be a person to be online. And when I think about relationship, when I think about our ability to have difficult conversations, I will yell at you in my car on the road, but if I'm standing next to you, I won't have that same relationship. I'll yell at you online, but if we have some sort of human connection, I won't. And so part of his piece was looking structurally at how social media platforms could be better about specifically looking at who's online, and not because of what they say, but really also then trying to create algorithms that preference nuance, that preference complex thought. And your complex thought can be on the right or the left. It doesn't have to be in one specific space. But if you're preferencing nuance, you're getting to a different kind of space online. So it's a podcast that I really recommend.
Fantastic. So book recommendations, podcast recommendations.
We're
I would
an
also
all-service
add
panel.
on this that you take a look at the work of the Difficult Conversations Lab at Columbia University, because I think that, and the book by Peter Coleman out of that area, which also, I think, provides a lot of really interesting food for thought. What a great panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.